Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people.
I have the pleasure to inform you that on this day, the island of New Orleans and province of Louisiana were amicably surrendered to the commissioners of the United States.
Louisianians struggled with their new identity. Now they were Americans.
They had been subjects of a monarchy. They had no real experience with the democratic process. They spoke different languages.
Their ways of life confounded their new countrymen.
When the Americans came to Louisiana and to New Orleans, one of the things that startled them was the tremendous amount of latitude that free blacks enjoyed. They were not prepared for that.
But Louisiana would prove itself on the field of battle.
They fought like desperados and deserve distinguished praise.
And in the fields of sugarcane and cotton, where the labor of slaves created incredible wealth.
New Orleans in the first half of the century was above all a boom town.
I don't think it was so wonderful. I really don't. They left a rich legacy of architecture, but they also were major players in America's greatest ugliness, and that was slavery.
At the height of a prosperity based on the enslavement of others, Louisiana would be forced to choose between allegiance to the United States or secession. Her choice would cost her people more than they could have imagined.
After generations as a European colony, Louisiana joined the young American nation at the turn of the 19th century. And less than 60 years later, she would tear herself away from it again. In those intervening years, however, political, economic, and cultural forces combined to begin the long process of Americanizing Louisiana, a process that, some feel, continues to this day.
At the dawn of the new century, a young American sailed down the Mississippi River and took command of the vast territory known as Louisiana. His name was William Charles Cole Claiborne. Along with General James Wilkinson and a small American army, Claiborne hoisted an American flag over New Orleans, and on December 20th, 1803, Louisiana was joined to the United States, forever changing both. William C.C. Claiborne was only in his 20s when he became governor of the Louisiana Territory, an area larger than the entire United States at that time. 3/4 of the population and nearly all of the wealth were concentrated in lower Louisiana near the mouth of the Mississippi. The Americans soon discovered that even more formidable than the sheer size of Louisiana was the diversity of its people.
Acquiring Louisiana raised significant challenges politically, religiously, culturally for the Americans. The native population of Louisiana viewed the Americans with a great deal of suspicion. The Americans viewed the native Louisianians with a great deal of suspicion.
Congress divided this region from the rest of the Purchase and assigned it to Governor Claiborne. The territory of Orleans, as it was called, encompassed most of the present state of Louisiana, except Baton Rouge and the Florida parishes. New Orleans was the largest city in the antebellum South and one of the leading ports of the continent. It was a bustling frontier community of more than 10,000. To the Americans, these people seemed utterly alien. At first glance, young Claiborne seemed ill-prepared for the enormous job of ruling a foreign people.
He came to govern the colony without being able to speak French, and in some ways, I think in some ways was perplexed by some of the customs of the society that he found himself the master of.
A shrewd statesman, Governor Claiborne quickly learned to play the game of Louisiana politics. Of course, at times, even he found it difficult to embrace these strange Creoles.
To bring these folks to their senses, we'll have to aim cannons at them and knock down the walls of the city from top to bottom.
Some Creoles came to see New Orleans as a city under enemy occupation.
A few of the French officers and citizens are mortified at the loss of this delightful country and seem to foster great hatred to the Americans. It requires much address and prudence to preserve the harmony of the city.
They despised the American as being uncouth. They knew they would not be able to absorb the Americans the way they had absorbed the Spanish, that their culture would be swamped. And they were right.
Americans pour in daily, not in families, but in large bodies. The leading gentlemen, when not talking of tobacco and cotton, find it very amusing to abuse and ridicule French morals, French manners, and French houses.
Even the public ballroom, where Creoles and Americans came together for entertainment, degenerated into what Claiborne called a theater of disorder.
A fracas originated in a contest between some young Americans and Frenchmen.
30 Americans and Frenchmen scuffled with each other. It was an infernal melee.
But drunken brawls weren't the only threat that required Governor Claiborne's vigilance. Long after Governor Claiborne assumed control, Spanish troops lingered in Louisiana, raising the American suspicions.
Spain had been careful enough to get Louisiana, to use it as a buffer to keep the Americans away from the silver mines of Mexico. It makes a lot of sense that the Spanish did not want to see this buffer state surrendered.
With Texas to the west and Florida to the east, Louisiana was surrounded by Spanish territory. Rumors of conspiracy spread throughout Louisiana like a summer fever. Tensions ran high. Then in 1810, the first shots of a small revolution were fired.
I yesterday returned from St. Francisville, a little town in the Spanish territory, where I found the whole country in a state of rebellion.
Anglo-Americans had been pouring into Baton Rouge and lands east of the Mississippi, all part of Spanish Florida at that time. On September 23rd, Philemon Thomas led a small force of Americans from St. Francisville.
They marched on Baton Rouge, overthrew the Spanish fort, which was not difficult to do. Like you can visualize, it was sort of a sleepy place. I think one person was killed and 2 wounded. But they then established the Republic of West Florida.
These so-called Florida parishes declared their independence from Spain and raised a flag over Baton Rouge bearing a lone star.
And suddenly, these now independent parishes join with the part of Louisiana that was bought in the purchase and become part of the state of Louisiana in 1812.
In time, treaties would establish Louisiana's present borders at the Pearl River in the east and at the Sabine in the west. But even more than the threats from outside, it was the growing storm within her borders that would prove most ruinous to Louisiana.
The flourishing situation of the country enables the people to buy slaves very fast. Here you will ask, what do they want with so many Negroes? The answer is to make more money. Again you will ask, what do they want with so much money? The answer is to buy more Negroes.
Since its founding more than a century before, Louisiana's survival had depended on slavery. But now, under American rule, the region's plantation economy was beginning to change and grow, and the demand for slaves grew with it. Cotton became king in Louisiana first, almost before any other place in the antebellum South. That's because the first working cotton gin in the entire Mississippi Valley was built by two Louisianians in 1795. Following a newspaper description of Eli Whitney's machine, a Baton Rouge area planter, Daniel Clark, and a master mechanic, John Barclay, transformed the region's cotton industry. John Barclay was a slave.
Soon, Daniel Clark's cotton gins were operating up and down the river, and by the time Eli Whitney's cotton revolution had occurred on the Atlantic coast, cotton was already galvanizing a new economic prosperity for Louisiana.
With the coming of the cotton gin, Louisiana's fields were soon blanketed in white. Anglo-American planters flocked to the territory of Orleans, hoping to get rich.
These individuals were simply businessmen. They came to make a profit in cotton production, and they came and found themselves able to acquire land in one of the richest river deltas in the world. And what they did was expand that production of cotton as rapidly as possible, and they pushed the slave workforce.
More and more slaves were needed to plant, pick, and process the cotton. But if cotton was king, there was a rival to the throne: sugar.
Sugar had been grown in Louisiana since colonial times. Prior to the 1790s, however, there was no good process for refining sugar. In 1795, Etienne Boré, a sugar planter at New Orleans who would later be mayor of the city, perfected a good process for refining sugar. Sugar became a major cash crop along the lower Mississippi Valley, as Louisiana soon emerged as a major sugar producer for the United States.
Later, sugar production would be further revolutionized by inventor Norbert Reyer. Just as the cotton gin had expanded cotton production, Reyer's more efficient vacuum pan processing would increase the demand for sugar and slaves. It was a bitter irony for a man who was himself a descendant of slaves. Sugar and cotton transformed Louisiana and the institution of slavery. Vast plantations sprang up along the river. Some were manned by as many as 1,000 slaves. Agriculture was assuming the spirit of the industrial age. Like the factories of the North, profitable plantations operated as well-oiled machines, with human beings functioning as little more than parts to be worn out and replaced.
The great factories were, in the beginning of the 19th century, were not indoors. They were on southern cotton and sugar plantations. They were factories in the fields.
what they usually did was found out what would be your maximum weight for an average stay. So for example, if you could pick 300 pounds of cotton, they expected 300 pounds every day. If you came in under, you'd be beaten. If you had a very good day and you brought in more, that became your new quota.
They used to whip slaves if they didn't pick enough cotton. They were stripped of all clothing and whipped with rawhide. Then they'd be put back to picking cotton with all that suffering.
The only thing that exceeded the demand for slaves was the desire for profit. Within a few years of the purchase, the slave population surged to over 35,000. More than half of all Louisianians were in bondage. With the purchase, American ideals of liberty had come to Louisiana, but not to Louisiana's slaves. In colonial times, Louisiana's slaves were governed by the Code Noir, the Black Code, which guaranteed them certain limited rights. But those rights were abolished by the Americans.
Discipline was given almost wholly to the masses under the American legal code. They no longer would recognize slave marriages. Husband could be sold apart from his wife. Children could be sold apart from their families. Slaves owned property. That would change under the Americans.
In an uneasy compromise with Northern lawmakers, Congress banned the importation of slaves to the United States in 1808. However, that didn't stop slaves from being traded within the United States. And many hundreds more were smuggled into Louisiana by bands of pirates, like Jean Lafitte.
The great numbers daily imported is alarming to the thinking part of the people. I am fearful that unless a stop is soon put to the increasing of the number, that day is fast approaching when whites will fall a sacrifice to the blacks.
That day came on January 8th, 1811. The uprising made news around the world and shook the foundations of slavery at home in Louisiana.
The largest slave rebellion that took place within the territorial limits of the United States was in fact led and organized by an immigrant, if you will, a black man who had been a slave on the island of Saint-Domingue, who was a driver on a plantation there in St. Charles Parish.
To the planters, they were brigands and bandits, but to their fellow slaves, Charles Deslandes and his followers were revolutionaries. Soon their ranks grew to as many as 500, according to some estimates. The rebels' objective was to travel River Road and attack New Orleans. According to one of the slaves, once in the city, their goal was simply détruire les blancs, that is, to kill the whites. Less than a day's journey from their target, they were halted at Destrehan Plantation.
We have been so happy as to meet the brigands. Their colors displayed in full arrogance, we rushed upon their troops, of whom we made considerable slaughter.
Well armed, the planters' militia was joined by federal troops and artillery. Soon the fields and marshes were littered with the corpses of slaves. When the revolt was over, 2 whites had been killed. According to official records, 66 slaves lost their lives. Patrols later discovered